We looked at the epic prophetical events that have happened with the nation of Israel and saw how sure we can be about our faith. We looked at how Israel was scattered, the nation, the people were scattered in AD 70, and they were scattered throughout the world. When John Thomas and Robert Roberts were doing their work, the Jewish people were living in over 100 different countries and speaking over 80 different languages, and the land of Israel was desolate and part of the Ottoman Empire. How would that ever be put back together? So when the prophet saw that vision in Ezekiel chapter 37 of the dry bones scattered, and we're told that the bones are the whole house of Israel, and that valley where they are is the graves, the nations that Israel was scattered in. How would that ever be put back together again? It would have seemed like an impossibility, yet our brethren in those days had the faith and conviction to look at the Word of God and then to say that they would come back together, that Israel would be restored, even though it looked impossible for that to happen. So then we saw how the bones came together and how the Jews came from the four corners of the earth back to the land of Israel, and how the nation was restored against all probability that took place. And so the bones came together. People that spoke 80 different languages were now speaking a language that had been dead, that had not been living, but had been brought back to life again, that had been updated. They were able to come back to their land, and the land was then going to bear fruit, and there would be agriculture and industry and all the things that a nation needs to exist, and all those things came together. And then in 1948 the nation of Israel was formed, and then there was an influx of refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Arab lands that came back to the nation, and that little small nation was able to absorb all those refugees and to absorb those Jews that had come from the Holocaust, and a nation was come together. And then we looked at how over the last 70 years the heart of the nation has been changed from an adamant stone to a teachable heart. And we saw a different spirit that is developing amongst the Jews in Israel today that has been brought about by the hand of God. And then we looked at the future work that the Lord Jesus Christ is and the saints will do in teaching that nation and bringing them to a point that they will be able to come before the royal person of the Lord Jesus Christ when He returns in great glory, and the elders of the nation will be able to come, and then they will be able to enter into the new covenant. There's so much going on right now as far as the nations around Israel is concerned, and we didn't spend so much time looking at that yesterday, and we want to try and do that this morning in the short time that we have together. And so we've read this little section in Revelation about the water being dried up, the water of the Euphrates being dried up. So we want to look at that passage a little bit, and then look at some of the current events, hopefully, that are taking place. This is a book that I was privileged to be able to get a hold of. That's very old. It's from 1696. And it's by a man called Samuel Craddock, and it's an exposition and paraphrase of the book of Revelation. So very interesting to see what somebody so long ago thought about these things. And he comments on this section in the book of Revelation that we've just read together. This verse, Revelation 16, verse 12, "The sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." Right? So, I'm not sure if I put this on a slide or... No. Okay, so we have to read it from here. All right. "The sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates." So he's commenting on that verse. He says, "We may compare this with Revelation chapter 9, verse 13. Which is a more clear and full explication of it. Upon the great river Euphrates, that is," he writes, "the people inhabiting thereabout, as Isaiah 8, verse 7, the king of Assyria and his army is called the waters of the river. These are the Turks, that possess that part of the world upon the river Euphrates, so that this vial relates plainly to the sixth trumpet. So he's connecting the sixth trumpet with the vial here, the sixth vial pouring out on the river Euphrates. The subjects of the other vials are not literal, but mythical and metaphorical, and therefore Euphrates, in probability, is not to be understood literally here of that very river, but of the people about it. And the water thereof was dried up. That is, the Turkish Empire was diminished and lessened in order to the restoring the Jews. And if their restoring to their own land be intimated thereby, the overthrow of the Turks seems needful to remove impediments out of their way. Isn't that incredible? In 1696, and at that point the land of Israel was even more desolate, and it was part of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, if there was part of a great empire, in our perspective, if we thought, okay, the United States is a great empire, right? If we looked at that and said the United States, somebody wrote the United States is their power is going to be dried up and lessened, and eventually part of the United States is going to become a nation of this people that's scattered throughout 100 different nations in the world. They speak 80 different languages, but they're going to come back to this part of the United States, and they're going to have their nation that they had 2,000 years ago. I mean, that would be, people would laugh about that. And yet, this is what the Bible said was going to happen, and with this part of the Ottoman Empire, that this empire was going to disappear. And he actually gives detail there, doesn't he? Because he compares it to the river, and a river doesn't just dry up like that, right? So he said it's going to be lessened and diminished, is how he wrote about it in his work. And he referred to this verse in Isaiah, so he's comparing Scripture with Scripture, as we would do, and we would turn to this verse in Isaiah as well, Isaiah 8, verses 7 and 8, where it says, "Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria." So the king of Assyria, whose power base was on the river, Euphrates, the great river. So the king of Assyria is compared to the river, his power. Even the king of Assyria in all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall even reach unto the neck, and the stretching out of thy wings, his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. So the river overflowing is like the Assyrian army invading. That's the figure that the Scripture uses. And when a river overflows, it does that. Actually, just this spring in Brantford, the Grand River goes through Brantford, and it overflowed its banks. There was an ice jam, and the river just rose so quickly. And there's a dike that goes along part of the river in Brantford that they've built. And I've looked at that dike before, and I thought, that is so high. Why, it's almost like, why did they build it that big? Because I can't imagine that the river would ever go that high, that it would need to be that big. And this spring it went that high, and the water actually started coming over, and they had a neighborhood where it is down by the river. They had to go around door to door in the morning and get all the people to come over, because the water was starting to come over the top of this dike. And in the river there was these chunks of ice the size of cars, because there was an ice jam, and these ice chunks were coming down, and the water was moving very fast, and these big chunks of ice were actually hitting the trees on the side of the river and taking all the bark off the trees. And then there were trees also then in the river, moving down the river. So it was very destructive power, and if it hadn't been for the dike there, all those homes would have been very severely damaged by the river. So it's a very good figure that Scripture uses as a river and water moving in that way and overflowing its banks, and the destructive power that it has. And that's what the king of Assyria was going to be like. And that was on the Euphrates River. So in Revelation we see this figure used elsewhere. We see water being used as a symbol of people and multitudes in Revelation 17, verse 15. And the second verse down there, Revelation 12, verse 15, it talks about the serpent, the dragon, casting out of his mouth water as a flood. And that's a figure for his power and his army that is going to go after the woman and to carry her away, to destroy her. So the water represents the military power of those associated nations, as it did with Assyria and as it does here with the dragon in Revelation. So this man, Samuel Craddock, he said, therefore Euphrates, in probability, is not to be understood literally here of the river, that it's actually talking about the river's going to dry up, but rather the people about it. The power that has that, just like the power of Assyria was represented by the river, the water thereof was dried up. That is, the Turkish Empire was diminished and lessened in order to the restoring the Jews. And that's exactly what happened. The Turkish Empire was diminished and lessened. So at one time it was called the sick man of Europe because it was drying up. Its power was shriveling up. But it's interesting here because he has actually brought two events together. When he's written about this, he's connected two events together. The Turkish Empire is to be diminished and lessened, so that's one event. But that's going to happen so that the Jews could be restored to their land. And that kind of takes it to another level when you think about that, because he's not just said, well, the Turkish Empire is going to be diminished and lessened, and that on its own, you know, if I said the United States power is going to be diminished and lessened, some people would agree with me about that, right? They would say, yeah, Trump's a bit of a crazy guy. You know, we could see some things maybe not going so well, right? Or you could maybe make that prediction. And really all empires eventually fade as well. So maybe that on its own wouldn't be a great statement to make. But then to say that's going to happen so that the Jews can be restored to their land is really quite amazing. And that's exactly what happened. As the Turkish Empire's power was diminished and lessened, the Jews started to return to the land of Israel. Eliezer ben Yehuda, when he came and started raising the first native Hebrew-speaking child in almost 2,000 years and was living in Jerusalem, that was under the power of the Turks. But the Turkish Empire was ebbing. It was losing its power at that time when the first Jews started going back, the first Aliyah. But then in 1917, at the end of World War I, when the British took that area and then opened it up for immigration for the Jews, that's when that really began to happen. And this is exactly what happened. The Turkish Empire was diminished and lessened, and the Jews were then restored to their land. So the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Okay, we don't need to read that again, so we can go ahead. So this is just summarizing the points from that section we read at the beginning. So in the sixth vial, we have some events then that take place. Armageddon takes place in the sixth vial. And so we're expecting that to happen. We don't know exactly when, but we can see all the signs of it happening, and we'll look at some now this morning. So Armageddon takes place in the sixth vial. The Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth in the sixth vial. We looked at yesterday teachings that are prevalent in the sixth vial gather the nations to Armageddon. So there's going to be these unclean teachings that it compares to frogs. And if you look back at the time of the Exodus with the frogs, there was the plague of the frogs, and then they gathered them into heaps. And when it talks about it in the Psalms, it says that the land stank and it was corrupt. So these teachings like frogs are going to corrupt our earth, and they're going to bring the nations to Armageddon. So that's why we were saying yesterday, when we listen to what the media says about Israel, we have to be very careful what we believe, because the media is the mouthpiece of the governments of this world and the statements that the governments make. And those statements are going to gather the nations against Israel at the time of Armageddon and against the Lord Jesus Christ. So they're not going to be healthy teachings. They're going to be teachings that are going to corrupt people's minds and distort people's thinking. So those teachings are prevalent in our time, in the sixth vial. And in the time of the sixth vial, the area and peoples that live in the region of the Euphrates lose their power. And that's not going to be just limited to, as we're gonna see in a moment, that's not going to just be limited to the Ottoman power. But other powers that are in that area of the Euphrates, they're not going to become powerful either. That statement has to do with the time of the sixth vial, the whole time of the sixth vial, that the Aryan peoples that live in the region of the Euphrates are going to lose their power. And there's a sort of an old map of the Euphrates, and you can see it starts up in Syria, maybe even up in Turkey, I guess, and comes all the way down through Iraq and down to the Persian Gulf. So that's the area of the Euphrates. We're just going to take a few minutes to Samuel Craddock in that book. He linked it with Revelation chapter 9. And it's very interesting to do a study of the trumpets, the woe trumpets, and a really interesting, great reading to go through that section in Eureka and look at how Brother John Thomas expounded that. We're just going to look at it very briefly this morning. But what's interesting is this was the region of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, going back before the Ottoman Turks and the Arabs came. And there were Christian groups in those areas that were persecuted by the Byzantine Greek Orthodox Roman Church, that branch of it. And it tells us a little bit about that in this Atlas of World History there. The Monophysite Christian populations of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, who had suffered years of persecution by Constantinople, welcomed the Arabs as liberators. That's quite amazing, isn't it? But these were Christians who objected to mainstream religion, like us, that objected to the worship of icons in the Greek Orthodox Church, that were not believing in the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, as they say. So these were people that objected to that, and they were persecuted for their beliefs. And they actually welcomed the Arabs as liberators. And of course, the Arabs were coming under the banner of Muhammad, and he was for one God. And so because they believed in one God, they actually had relief under the Arab rule when they came. So really it was a deliverance for them. And we can see that in Revelation chapter 9, verse 4, in a figure, because it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men who have not the seal of God in their foreheads. So when they came, there was going to be a difference between some people that had the truth, the sealing of God in their foreheads, and those who did not, those that had, as it were, the mark of the beast, the thinking of the false religion in their thinking. And there was going to be a difference made when these people came. And that's exactly how it was. And so it's a very fascinating time in history to look at. And then after that we have the sixth angel sounding the trumpet, which is so that was when the Arabs came, it was the fifth trumpet, and then we have the sixth trumpet here, which came afterwards, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, this is the one that Samuel Craddock referred to, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So these powers were going to come from the east, from beyond the Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. And so you had these hordes that, including the Turks, that then came from beyond the Euphrates and came up into the area of what was the Byzantine Empire and into the area of Syria, and they moved across here, and that's how the Ottoman Empire came into being. I'm sorry for going through this fast, but I just want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the current events that we want to get to. So that's how we ended up with the Ottoman Empire, which was a very big and powerful empire, and you can see how it stretched around this whole area of North Africa, and down into toward Iran and where Persia is there on the map, and then even up into that part of Europe, Albania and Serbia, Bulgaria, and so on. And of course they took Constantinople, and it became Istanbul. And that's where that great church was, St. Sophia, that was the jewel of the Eastern Church. So that was a very big, powerful empire. So for Samuel Craddock, he looks at that and he says, well, this empire is going to be diminished and lessened up. And the reason that it's going to be diminished and lessened is so that the Jews can be restored to the land. And that's exactly what happened. And there's that quote again. Well, Brother Robert Roberts came along a little later, obviously, than Samuel Craddock, but he saw things exactly the same way, and he could see. By the time Robert Roberts comes, this is in 1885, this is from that, there's a little book called Letters to the Elect of God in a Time of Trouble, and this is, Brother Robert Roberts is trying to encourage his brethren and sisters by looking at world events and saying, look how close we could be to the return of Christ. So, he's looking at these exact same passages that we're looking at, and he writes, we see the way preparing for the coming new order of kings whose land has been desolated by the Euphratean Ottoman. A new turning point has in fact been reached, at which there is scarcely anything we may not shortly see in the way of completion of the political program on which our eyes have been fixed with earnest solicitude for over 30 years past. So we've been watching this, he says, for 30 years, and we're now reaching a point where we could really see some changes that are going to take place with the Turkish Empire. So the Turkish Empire wasn't doing very well, obviously, now at this point in 1885. And then he continues on, if the Turkish Empire disappear, which is now almost the daily expectation of politicians, the Holy Land will be liberated from the only obstacle that restrains the full development of impending Jewish restoration under English protection, and there is nothing then between us and that precious parenthesis in verse 15, behold, I come as a thief. And it wasn't really that long after 1885, 32 years, is that right, till 1917, when the British took Palestine and the Jews were restored and the Ottoman Empire was gone. So that's what Brother Roberts was looking for, and it materialized exactly the same way. Of course, Brother John Thomas wrote about this as well, and this is very interesting what Brother John Thomas wrote here. Again, he interprets it the same way. Hence, the water of the great river Euphrates, in like manner, represents the military power of the Ottoman Empire, which is dissipated by a process of evaporation, or drying up, a gradual exhaustion, so as to at last leave the channel of the river in the heart of the great city empty. So he's now making a figure which you can spend some time looking at, is how that the Euphrates is dried up, as it was when the Persians went into Babylon. That's how they got into Babylon. They diverted the river Euphrates, and then they were able to go in through the riverbed and take the city. It was that night when there was the writing on the wall. That's what happened. So the river was dried up so that he could get into Babylon. And so he's saying that's going to be the same figure. The river is going to be dried up so that Christ and the saints can get into the great city and overcome it and establish the kingdom of God. So a really interesting figure. So at last the channel of the river into the heart of the great city empty. And he says, devoid of all power to impede or interfere with the operations developing in the southeastern recesses of the empire. And he's talking about the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. So the Lord Jesus Christ is going to come, and why is then this great power, the Ottoman power, dried up, and the powers in the Euphrates? So that they don't have power to interfere with the development of the restoration of the Jews and God's work with them, and eventually the return of Christ to the earth. And then that will be like the little stone power that's going to come in through that dry riverbed into the great city and overcome it and destroy it. So very interesting figure. But that's the principle then. The idea that we have to keep in mind is that this happens so that those nations don't have power to impede and to interfere with that work that God is going to do. This is a really interesting quote. It's from History Jerusalem in the 20th Century by Martin Gilbert. And it's quoting from the official British history at the time. And it's just so interesting how this person wrote this. You kind of think, did they know about Revelation chapter 16? Did this official British historian know about this? Or is he just unwittingly using the language of Revelation? But this is how he describes the Ottomans leaving Jerusalem. The last kick of the dying Ottoman authority in a city where it had been supreme for 4 centuries, 400 years. As the Turkish flood finally ebbed away into the shadowy depths of the valley of Jehoshaphat. That's how he describes the Turks leaving Jerusalem in the official British history. And so the power was dried up and they were gone. That's the Euphrates today. And you can see it goes through Iraq, and it goes up into Syria, and then starts up, the watershed starts up in the bottom part of Turkey. So that river really does represent all those powers to the north of Israel and to the east of Israel that are in that area that could impede the development of the restoration of the Jews. And that's an interesting question, because we look for, and I'm sure that we've all probably thought about it and looked at it in Ezekiel 38, where it talks about the peace and safety that is going to come upon those in the land. And we definitely do see prosperity in the land. Israel today is an economic superpower. And now with the discovery of oil and gas, they really are a very powerful, economically powerful nation in the earth. There's no doubt about that. So there's a lot of prosperity, and there's definitely security from the Israel Armed Forces, from the Iron Dome anti-missile systems and things like that they've developed. So there's definitely peace, there's definitely prosperity, but there's still terrorism. There's still bars and gates, so how are those problems going to be resolved? And maybe they won't be resolved before the return of Christ. If we believe that Christ comes first to his household, and then after that is revealed to the world, there's going to be a time there where the saints are doing some work, and the peace that we see in Ezekiel 38 could develop more fully. But there's nothing to impede the return of Christ. That's very important in that what we may look for. There's nothing that would say the return of Christ could not be now. Definitely not that. But we still ask this question, how would there be peace? These are those verses from Ezekiel 38. Let's just read them together. He comes against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. That's an incredible verse. I mean, when you think about what we saw yesterday, how the land of Israel was desolate, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. Yet it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Gog says, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely. All of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? And Gog will think an evil thought, and he will come down like a whirlwind on the nation. We've been looking at some of the prophecies around Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel 37, and there's a whole section of prophecies of restoration that look at the restoration from different viewpoints and in different ways, like the prophecy of the dry bones, the prophecy of the 2 sticks, the prophecy of the shepherd and the looking after the flock. So there's several prophecies of restoration. Then we have Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, and then we have the vision of the future temple. We looked at yesterday how the focus of the invasion is on the mountains of Israel, and that at that time the returned Israelites are dwelling safely, and they are wealthy. And we definitely see that picture coming together. We also know that Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with Gog when he comes down, all of them with shield and helmet. And this is where it's got, the last few years have just been amazing, the way the Middle East has changed. This is from a little while ago, and we see this more and more all the time in the news, how that Russia, Iran, and Syria are working together. And it's really, it's quite troublesome for Israel to have Russia there on the border, and to have Iran trying to build these bases also that are very close to the border. And Iran has always worked against Israel through Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is on the northern border, a terrorist group that has taken over a lot of Lebanon, and they operate in that area. They have a lot of missiles, and they're very well supplied by Iran. But now Iran is working more directly in that area. Just want to think about Syria for a moment. This is on the Golan Heights in Israel. I took that picture one evening. There's all these, at that time you could go up there and walk around. I don't think you can anymore. But this is just kind of up above the Galilee. So this is where the Syrians were before 1967, 73, right? They were up on the Golan Heights, and from here they could shell the Jewish communities down in the valleys, and that's what they did. So the Jewish farmers at that time actually had armored tractors, because often when they were plowing the fields, there would be shells also plowing the field at the same time. That's what it was like down especially in the Hula Valley, which is just a little bit north of this. So Syria was dominating up on the heights, and there's a famous Israeli spy, a spy that they had called Eli Cohen, who had infiltrated right up to the top of the Syrian regime, and he was in the very top circle of the Syrian regime, and he was relaying all this information back to Israel. Kind of a funny story, but he actually toured these areas on the Golan Heights with the heads of the army. That's how high he had gotten up in Syria. And he said the soldiers, it's so hot for the soldiers up here in these areas. He said, why don't you plant trees, eucalyptus trees here, and then the soldiers will have shade. And they actually took him up on the idea, and then the Israelis would just look for the eucalyptus trees and take them out. Eventually, Eli Cohen got discovered, and he was hung by the Syrians. So then it was a very what they were doing at this time as well is they were blocking the waters, also of diverting the headwaters for the Jordan River that would come down from this area. This is the watershed for the Jordan, just north of this, and so there was a threat to Israel for water. They're so desperate for water in the Middle East, so there was a big threat that they would also lose the water. Not only was there all the shelling from up on the heights down to their communities, but also there was the worry about the water. And at that time, Russia was in Syria as well. At that time, Syria was very, very powerful. This is the balance of power in the Middle East in 1967, June 1967, when that Six-Day War happened. So Israel's army, as you can see, was mostly reservists, whereas Egypt and Syria had a standing army, and Jordan as well, it was larger. But when you look at Israel had 800 tanks, whereas Egypt and Syria together had 1,800 tanks, and that was all the latest Soviet equipment at the time. Israel had 350 planes, whereas just Egypt and Syria had double that amount, plus they had Jordan, and they also had Iraq and Algeria also helping them. So the balance of power was very much against Israel in 1967. And the point is that Israel was under an existential threat. Egypt and Syria's intention was to destroy the Jewish state completely and to eradicate it. That was their declared goal, and that was their intention, and they had the power to do so in 1967. And again in 1973, when Israel was in a very desperate situation. I mean, the Six-Day War, they won it in 6 days. Like the guy said yesterday, who's ever heard of a 6-day war? right? It was really incredible how that, the history of that, how it all happened. In 1973, there was a surprise attack on the day of Yom Kippur, as many of you may know. On that day of prayer, fasting, when everything's shut down in Israel, there's like no cars on the streets, totally quiet, right? On that day, they launched a surprise attack, Egypt and Syria. And the power against them then was really, really stacked against them, and the Egyptians and Syrians had these advanced missiles for taking out. Israel lost a lot of planes in that 73 war. It was a very, very desperate time. You can see that Israel had 360 planes, whereas Egypt and the Arab powers had 1,600 planes. So again, Israel was definitely in 1973 under an existential threat. They really could have been completely destroyed. And then there was Iraq. Iraq was a great threat to Israel, and Iraq was developing nuclear weapons. And at the time of Menachem Begin, they went in on one of these raids. There's a book about it called Raid on the Sun, when they actually went in and took out the nuclear reactor, and they were condemned by the world for doing that. I don't think the United States would have been so condemning of them when they actually went into Iraq, because Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons because of what Israel had done and targeted this their reactor and taken it out. But when you think about that today there is no existential threat to Israel from Egypt. There is no existential threat to Israel from Syria. There is no threat to Israel from Iraq. The Middle East is completely changed from 1967 to 73. And I think that we can really see that process that happens that we've been talking about in Revelation chapter 16. The Ottoman Empire was dried up, but the power of these other nations that have been around Israel have been dried up as well, so that the work that God is doing in bringing back His people can continue on without impediment to some degree. So this is a man writing in the Washington Free Beacon. This is like in Washington. Is that here or is that on the other coast? I don't know. One of the Washingtons. I'm not even sure. But he's writing about this, Abraham Rabinovich. He says, both the Syrian and Iraqi armies, which constituted a major threat to Israel's eastern front, have been paralyzed by civil wars, and any recovery is seen as distant. As for Egypt, it is too consumed by internal problems to constitute a serious threat in the near future. So, and that's the situation today. Israel still has threats to it. There's no doubt about that, but they do not anymore have an existential threat to them. So we can see what Brother John Thomas wrote, that these nations are devoid of all power to impede or interfere with operations developing in the southeastern recesses of the empire. This is true. This is the situation today. Even Hezbollah, who isn't an existential threat to Israel, but is still a serious threat, but not an existential threat, has been involved in the war in Syria and has lost power from being involved in that civil war. So the threats to Israel today, there's the threat of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which is like a thorn in the side to Israel, and for those communities that are in that area of the Gaza Strip, when there was all those missiles coming, which were quite serious. The media makes out that they aren't, but they actually terrorize the people in those communities because these missiles might be rudimentary, but they're still deadly. They don't have a guidance system. But if I was shooting missiles at Washington, D.C., just for the point of terrorizing the population, I wouldn't really care to have a guidance system, right? I'm just trying to terrorize people, so fire them randomly at Washington, D.C. That's what was happening to the communities around the Gaza. So people were getting hurt by these. If you actually, I have pictures of it, but the schools in a town called Sderot by the Gaza Strip, actually they've built these massive cement canopies over the schools to protect them from missiles. This is how serious it is. So Hamas is a threat, but not an existential threat to Israel. The PLO the Palestine Liberation Organization, Mahmoud Abbas, that is in the West Bank. Again, they can cause pain for Israel, but they're not an existential threat. And their power is actually being lessened now. I don't think Trump is helping them much. Hezbollah up in the north, we talked about. ISIS, this is a little bit, a few years actually since I made this map, and ISIS, of course, is pretty much, at least at the moment, is a thing of the past. Iran is a threat to Israel, probably one of the bigger threats to Israel at this time, but I don't think an existential threat unless they were actually to use nuclear weapons or something on Israel. But of course that would wipe out all the Arab population as well, so I don't know if they would do that. At the same time, we see Israel becoming very prosperous. I'm sure you've obviously all know about the oil and gas that has been discovered. We talked about that yesterday with Castella's boat, right? So he kept getting more waters for Israel, so they can be very thankful for that. So Israel is becoming very prosperous, and trade with India as well as many other places in the world, because Israel is so far ahead in their tech and advancements in so many ways. But we still wonder exactly how this peace may develop, and we keep see events moving ahead, and it's a very interesting time in that. But one thing that we talked about yesterday, which really has been, I don't think we will see from a Bible perspective, and also now from a practical perspective of what we see, is this idea of a two-state solution. It really is becoming impossible because of the amount of communities, Jewish communities, in that biblical heartland in the West Bank area. And to move all those people, 400,000 people, is just not feasible. So there's beginning to be different ideas coming for peace. So we may see a greater peace come. Ooh, we are going to run out of time, right? We should probably finish. When do you guys want to finish Sunday school? 10:30. I have another 5-10 minutes. Okay. This is really interesting, what's happening now with Saudi Arabia. So we, in Ezekiel 38, we have this grouping of nations that we talk about, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, which say to Gog, "Are you come to take a spoil and to take a prey?" And we do believe that Sheba and Dedan is the area of Saudi Arabia, and there's some different proofs here for that. Genesis 25, verses 1 to 4, the descendants of Abraham and Keturah, the cousins of the Midianites, were Sheba and Dedan. There's a couple other names of Sheba and Dedan in the Old Testament, but they don't fit when we look at Ezekiel 38 and look at where they originated from. Gesenius lexicon identifies Sheba with the Sabaeans, a nation and region of Arabia. He supposes there were two Arabian tribes, Sheba and Dedan, one in the north and one in the south. Smith's Bible Dictionary identifies Sheba with the great South Arabian kingdom, and Werner Keller in the Bible as History identifies Sheba with the ancient kingdom of Sheba, based in southern Arabia, a merchant power who did business with the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. So there's definitely a lot of evidence that Sheba and Dedan were in the area of Saudi Arabia. And we're not going to look at Tarshish this morning. Obviously we don't have time to look at everything. But I do believe that is the Western merchant powers of Britain, and I think the United States fits into that, and some of the Commonwealth countries as well. So we do see that South alliance really coming together, and this is saying how that Britain must side with the Saudis against Iran. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. Like when we were just talking about 1967, 1973, at that time you had pan-Arabism, and the leader of Egypt, the president of Egypt at the time, was really bringing the Arab world together, and he was uniting them against Israel. And I mean, the Arab world has never been that united. Even probably the most united they were been is trying to destroy Israel. But I mean, they've always had problems amongst them. It's their kind of the character of their people, it seems like. But they were, kind of together in those wars. We saw that all those nations were united in fighting against Israel. But that has totally changed particularly in the last few years. And it's really absolutely phenomenal seeing that change develop. And we really have this northern axis of Iran, Syria, and then the proxies like Hezbollah and Russia all coming together, and that's your Shiite Muslims. And then in the south you have the Sunni Muslims, which is like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and they've strengthened their alliances with Britain, with the United States, and it's Saudi Arabia today is way more worried and sees Iran as a threat over anyone else. That's their big concern is Iran. So much so that they are very much warming up to Israel. And it's really at the point of, there's a lot of discussion between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They're just not openly shaking hands too much, although Saudi Arabia recently just made a statement how that Israel was entitled to a homeland, which was just absolutely phenomenal. So we see a really big change in Saudi Arabia's attitude to Israel, because Israel and Saudi Arabia have a common enemy in Iran and a common concern with Iran. So for a long time it's sort of been known that Saudi Arabia is kind of, saying to Israel, if you want to use our airspace to attack Iran, you can, just, don't tell anybody we told you. You can use it. Right? That's been known for a while, but it's getting to be more and more open as Saudi Arabia sees this threat from Iran. And the UK, actually, I was quite surprised at this, that they've just been building a new permanent military base in Bahrain. So Britain and the United States are still very much involved in the Gulf region, obviously, again, for economics. And the issue in Syria and the civil war has really divided the Arab world, very much so, to the point that you almost have Saudi Arabia going to war with Iran and Syria in Syria, and they're very much involved in that. So it's really brought this split in the Arab world into a north and south, which is so fascinating when we read Ezekiel chapter 38. And Saudi Arabia has this problem with in Yemen with some rebels there that are more allied with Iran, or being fed kind of missiles and things from Iran. And there was these missile attacks on Saudi Arabia from Yemen, launched by these groups. And I don't know the dates. This was recent. I'm just trying to see if I can see the date on this screen grab, but March 26, 2018. So yeah, very recently that this happened. And so the Saudi-led coalition threatening retaliation against Iran. So it really is at a boiling point between these two foes. So in the report there it says the military coalition, so you have a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia, is threatening retaliation against Iran, accusing the Shiite power of being behind multiple Yemeni rebel missile attacks on the kingdom. So that's how much you have this north-south division that has developed in the Middle East, exactly like we see in Ezekiel 38. So it really, really is quite fascinating. And you see the United States, I know Tillerson already got fired, but recently he was in, this is December or October last year, October, Tillerson was in the Middle East as the U.S. seeks a Saudi-Iraqi axis against Iran. That's trying to, put together exactly what we see in Ezekiel 38. So that division that's developed in the Arab world really is very fascinating. And at the same time, the Syrian thing continues to go on. In the Syrian barrage, a confident message signed by Iran and Russia. So again, Russia warns the Saudis deploying ground troops in Syria would unleash a new world war. I mean, that's how it is, right? So the world really is at a boiling point between the north and the south. And that's Daniel chapter 11, isn't it? The king of the north and the king of the south. And we see that picture just come into focus. It's another sign of the return of Christ and how close we are. That the final stage, the final drama is being set, and all the pieces we see coming into position. And then we talked about this already. For Israel, concern over Iran leads to better ties with the Arab states. And when Israel, who's the technological superpower and has so many good ideas and inventions and so forward in those areas, if they start working with Saudi Arabia, who has all the money, and both of them have, now Israel has the oil and gas, and of course Saudi Arabia's still very rich from the oil, even though the prices have been going up and down, but they're still a very rich nation. And they're actually talking about building this new city, this innovative city. So they're starting to work together, and there's going to be a lot of prosperity that could come out of that. Even more prosperity than we see now in the Middle East. So it's just amazing to see everything coming together like this. The Gulf states looking to buy Israeli developed defense systems, right? So they're going, Iran's our threat. Israel has the best missile defense systems in the world. Okay, let's get over this and work together. And that's what we see. That's what we see happening. This is really fascinating with Donald Trump moving the embassy. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, "Oh, moving an embassy, what's the big deal?" But what it does is it gives Israel a lot more, validates their claim to Jerusalem, and actually not to East Jerusalem as well, to the old city of Jerusalem. And that's why there's been such an uproar in the world about the United States moving their embassy, because it is symbolically a very significant thing. And Trump actually said, he said, I don't know if you saw that one, he said, I've already accomplished more than anybody else on the peace process. He said the hardest part of the peace process was the issue of Jerusalem. And he said, I've solved it already, right? Israel can have it. So I don't think he has solved it. We know from Scripture that that's not the case. But in moving the embassy, this is very insightful from the Telegraph in the UK. It says, Donald Trump has exposed a sad truth that the Arab world no longer cares about Palestine. The idea of a Palestinian state, the Gulf states, they're done with it. They're saying, they've messed up every opportunity. At Camp David, the whole West Bank was offered to them, with a few adjustments, and Arafat turned it down. And then Ehud Olmert came along, offered them all the West Bank with some border adjustments. We'll give you a bit of our land, and we'll take the communities, the big communities. They had a plan, worked it all out. They turned it down, and there's a lot more history in there as well with what's happened with the Palestinians in Jordan, and they're just not so favored in the Arab world. So you'll notice it was very interesting when Trump said about moving the embassy, all the opposition for moving the embassy came from the European Union, from the Vatican was very vocal and working a lot against it. The Arab states, they hardly said anything. They hardly said anything. And it really was very telling. And that's what this article was about. So that's where we are, just briefly in what's happening with the Middle East, and I'm sure that many of you look at it as well. Very fascinating. I just want to finish with what Brother Robert Roberts said, because he's writing that, and he says at the end of that quote, he says, there is nothing then between us and the precious parenthesis in verse 15, behold, as I come as a thief. And if Brother Robert Roberts could write that in 1885, and here we are, we see Ezekiel 38, everything coming into focus. We see the Jews back in the land. We see the Ottoman power gone. We see the existential threat, immediate threat to Israel gone around it. We see Russia coming back. We see all those things coming. I mean, what can we say? That there's definitely nothing between us and the precious parenthesis in verse 15. Behold, I come as a thief. Thank you.